that's a good question. I will ask them. I don't think so.
People were wondering how to find the PDF or the printed versions.
Have you found it on the website?
No, neither on the website.
Yes,
Because some people said that there is some publication waiting somewhere.
I will inform myself about that. They told me it's on the website from 10. If it's not on the website, that's not good. So I will inform myself and see if they're printed. Maybe you can answer, because obviously the report is not on the website.
What?
The report is not on the website.
Oh, on the
And, sorry, how do you pronounce your name?
Comyn?
Comyn.
Yeah.
Right. I will introduce you, Paul Comyn. I will introduce you as a senior skills and employability specialist at ILO.
Yep.
And then you will deal with the panel and Q&A. Yeah. And then we have an hour. Okay, I wait for 2 more minutes and I'll start to call people in.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, fine, thanks. Did you get an answer? Could you answer him?
Yeah, it's all right.
It's on the website. He said he didn't find it on the website. Sorry.
It's all right.
Okay, it's all right. He asked also if there are printed versions. Sorry?
I gave him printed version.
Are there printed versions? Should we?
Green policy. We don't. But exceptionally, we have some copies.
I will just have people listen on the website.
Okay. Yes.
Should I tell people to start? So please sit down, take your seats, and we're going to continue with the afternoon session number 3. Before that, I want to remind you again that the survey is on the website if you want to print it out and start reading it. Session number 3 is reforming apprenticeship systems, the challenges to this. I welcome the moderator, Paul Comyn, who is the Senior Skills and Employability Specialist at ILO. He is taking his seat in a few seconds, I hope. And then we have the panel. Afterwards, you will be able to ask questions and hopefully get the answers that you like. So, I think we're ready to go? Okay, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the afternoon's proceedings. As you see from the agenda, the session we're about to commence is focusing on the challenges associated with reforming apprenticeship systems. Before I introduce the panellists, I'll just start with a few opening remarks that might I guess, put our discussion in a bit of context. We've heard about how apprenticeships are a very old model of learning, and so when you start talking about reforming established systems, there are obviously many challenges to be addressed with that. And in fact, the other day there was this excerpt on BBC News, I think, that was talking about some recent archaeological discoveries in Sussex, I think it was, in the UK. And they actually started talking about how some of the artefacts that they were pulling out of the ground from 3,000 years ago were able to be analysed to distinguish between the marks that had been made on these timber structures by more experienced workers from the initial marks that were made on the timber from someone that was presumed to be an apprentice. So the idea that even 3,000 years BC there's some sort of apprenticeship-based model of learning, I guess, puts the challenge of reform in a different context, and perhaps gives us something to think about how central apprenticeships are to how people learn. Because I think we also need to differentiate between the idea of apprenticeship as a model of learning as opposed to an apprenticeship which is governed by a regulatory framework, which is employment-based if you follow the ILO sort of building blocks of quality apprenticeships, And the fact that if you look at how apprenticeships are changing, it's not just about how systems are changing, but about how the model of learning is being adapted in different contexts. And I think this is where you get into those issues around, well, what exactly is an apprenticeship? And how do you define an apprenticeship? And so then we're talking about reforming apprenticeships. What actually are we talking about reforming? Are we talking about reforming the model of learning, or are we talking about reforming the traditional employment-based model of school-to-work transition and preparation for an occupation? So, you know, they're not meant to be any sort of positional things, just simply some ideas, I think, to sort of put out there as teasers for this session. I think also we need to differentiate between what we mean by reform and what we mean by sort of continuous improvement or incremental change within a system. You know, what's simply ongoing adaptation in one apprenticeship system might be considered a reform in another. So maybe trying to crystallise, you know, what are substantial reforms that we're talking about in apprenticeship systems. And to that end, I mean, I think that there's a few, based on the discussions we've had this morning, something like the introduction of higher level apprenticeships. And again, that's, you know, so we're talking about the adoption of an apprenticeship-based model of learning within a higher education sector, or are we actually talking about the expansion of formal employment-based apprenticeship arrangements into the higher education sector where the universities become the off-the-job provider as opposed to vocational providers? So there's that kind of issue. Clearly the question of the duration of apprenticeships, the age of who is participating in apprenticeships, and the occupational coverage. Because I think that introduces the question then about, so are we still talking about apprenticeships, or are we talking about some other form of work-based learning that's just called an apprenticeship in one country, but depending on different sort of definitions, actually might not meet the definition of an an apprenticeship in some other country. The use of intermediary bodies, you know, we've heard of. In some systems that's been there since the inception or for quite a number of years. In other examples, the role of third parties, you know, group training companies or chambers or group employers as actors in apprenticeship systems. You know, I think in the context of the discussion around the gig economy and Industry 4.0, you know, I think are likely to become, you know, more of a sort of component of reform issues. Financing is obviously something there. We've got, you know, the UK example of some, you know, the new levy system coming in, the youth guarantee that's been trialled in Europe, and then linking to what was raised earlier around the universal entitlement to learning. You know, to what extent are apprenticeships going to feature as, you know, part of the range of programs that might be linked to a universal learning entitlement, which it seems is increasingly being talked about in the context of lifelong learning systems responding to future of work drivers. I think another reform issue it goes really to the heart of, you know, how do apprenticeships sit within a system of vocational preparation? You know, so the idea that an identity within an occupation is linked to a fixed amount of time spent in the workplace, learning a certain set of skills and becoming enculturated to that workplace and that community of practice. That's at the heart of, you know, traditional views of apprenticeships, and underpins how apprenticeships is often linked to industrial arrangements in particular sectors, and the duration of apprenticeships in particular occupations, you know, limit the ability of individuals to complete an apprenticeship because they haven't met the time served requirement, as opposed to meeting the competencies to allow advanced progression. But then delinking that to entry-level employment arrangements that are negotiated by social partners at a sector or national level, you know, creates a tension. So is that an area where we want to see reform or not, you know, is another issue. The last point I'd make, I guess, relates to the question of progression, which responds to the question of the status of apprenticeships and the link between vocational education and higher education, and of course whether or not certification and national qualification frameworks factor in how apprenticeships are designed, because that's not always the case, and we do still see separate certification arrangements for apprentices which really do limit the pathways for ongoing learning that apprentices can follow. So there's some ideas, or at least my scribbled notes that happened this morning and yesterday. And so now we turn to the panel to hear their views. And you'll see there are 3 questions that have been posed to the panellists, and the idea initially was to tackle all the 3 questions at once, but you saw a little confab earlier on, and we sort of last-minute decision was to split it up to try and make it a little bit more sort of interactive. So 1,000 thanks to the flexibility of the panellists to responding to that late change of agenda. So I'd like to start. I'll introduce the panellists first. So to my immediate right, we have Bettina Schaller, who's Global Head of Public Affairs with the Adecco Group. Bettina oversees the group's public affairs activities, as a board member of the World Employment Confederation, Vice Chair of the OECD Business Advisory Council, Employment, Labour and Social Affairs Committee, on the B20 Employment and Education Task Force, and the company's focal point for the Global Apprenticeship Network. Further along the dais, we have Helen Hoffmann, who's a Policy Officer for Vocational Education and Training within the Directorate General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission. Helen's role involves further developing and implementing EU VET or TVET policies, and prior to that worked as a social affairs advisor for a European Employers Association and the British Embassy in Berlin, I think it was. To the right there is Lorna, and Lorna Unwin is Professor Emerita in Vocational Education from the Department of Education, Practice and Society from the University College London Institute of Education. Professor Unwin is an expert in vocational education and training and the issues surrounding the use of workplaces to create expansive learning environments. She's particular interest in research in apprenticeships as a model of learning, and is currently engaged in a study of the history of technical education in the UK. Finally, we're joined by Matthäus Fandrejewski, apologies there. Matthäus is President of the CESI Youth Network and member of the Steering Committee of the European Apprenticeships Network. He started off his career as an apprentice in the period between 2006 and 2009 with the German Public Administration, and subsequently took on a position in the Migration Office where he was active in the Workers' Council. Since 2017, Matthäus has been studying International People Management at the Paris International Business School. So, ladies and gentlemen, they're the members of the panel that are with us this afternoon. And so I'd like to start, I guess, by asking the first question. And the first question is, what are the key challenges that confront apprenticeship systems? And I think we'll go in the order that we originally flagged. So, Helen, over to you, please.
Well, thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Well, this morning we heard about a bit the revival of apprenticeships, and I remember, let's say, around 5 years ago, there was a lot of mentioning of the golden era of apprenticeships. And I think now it's almost fair to say that we're entering perhaps a type of platinum age in the way apprenticeships are being seen worldwide. Now, perhaps, and also just to say again, to comment on this morning's discussion, I think there was a lot of consensus and common ground in the issues that have been put forward. It will be of no surprise to you that, of course, also at EU level, apprenticeships are very high up the policy agenda, and there's a strong interest of member states on the topic. Perhaps just before we enter the key challenges, if we look a bit at the context, Europe has still relatively high youth unemployment. It's down from over 24% to 15%, which is still more than double the normal youth unemployment. And if we look then at countries more specifically, we have, for example, Spain, Italy, where youth unemployment is still over 30%, also Greece, where it's over 40%. So there's, quite a range of countries, also compared to, for example, Germany, where you have less than, around 7%. So we have this range. Apprenticeships are still being used to tackle youth unemployment, but of course also they're being used a lot for skills matching. And more recently looking at also some reforms that we've seen, Malta is a country where you actually have had relatively low youth unemployment in recent years. It's actually now below 5%, and their apprenticeships are really used to tackle skills mismatches. So to really help the employer find the skills needed on the labor market and to give young people a good employment route. So this is a bit about the different and diverse situations. At EU level, we have a skills agenda for Europe that was adopted 2016, and there we really focus on making veteran apprenticeships a first choice rather than a plan B. And more recently, last year, the European Social Pillar was adopted, European Pillar of Social Rights, where you have 20 principles. Number one is to give everyone this, universal right of lifelong learning. Apprenticeships vet to be able to better master the transitions in the labor market. So that's perhaps just a bit the general background. Now, regarding the key challenges, I think a lot was, let's say, identified this morning. I would talk about maybe three main ones. One is, of course, that it takes time to reform systems, or also set up an apprenticeship system, especially one that's of quality and effectiveness, or that is effective. Second, the challenge of broader aspects, so having social partners involved, having good governance, regulation. So all these key factors are part of the second challenge. But also I think this question of actually finding, that Paul mentioned, let's say, definition or common understanding of what we are talking about. Because again, with apprenticeships, for example, we have the UK with, let's say, over 90% of a work-place component in the training. But then other member states where it's perhaps only 10 or 20%, but it's still called apprenticeships. So I think this question of definition is an interesting one. Amongst others. And then the third big challenge is indeed what was mentioned about apprenticeships, and not only now being for young people, but increasingly for adults, for up and reskilling. This question of how to link apprenticeships to employment 4.0, or how can apprenticeships become a 4.0. This question also of higher skills, I think that's a very important one, and the emergence more and more of higher vet and also professional education. This is in fact the topic of a CEDEFOP study and analysing the nature and role of apprenticeships in Europe. And we've seen that in the last 20 years there is a strong direction in this area, so meaning that also academic let's say, or teaching and learning universities are becoming more, let's say, or are getting a type of vocational drift. And on the other hand, apprenticeships are also inducing more, let's say, academization, academic learning. So I think there's some very interesting challenges that we see at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bettina. Helen. Bettina, would you like to respond to that question about challenges?
Yeah. So much for the opportunity to be here today, and I must say every time I am invited to talk about challenges, I'm delighted, because in my daily environment it's all about solutions the whole time. So for once to be able to put the challenges on the table is beautiful. I'd like to pick up, in the introduction you made on the fact that I'm sitting here as well as the focal point of the company to the global apprenticeship network. And I think it might be of interest to you in the room, since you have sitting here a person that comes from the employer side. So it's one of those global companies that have decided very willingly and passionately to be part of this global apprenticeship network, both in a global perspective, but then also within those national networks. So they're currently 13. I'm sure we will hear more about it. And as a company, we're actively engaged in about 10 of those, because that's where we have presence on the ground. So I'll be very much looking forward to telling you about those challenges from this employer perspective, of course, and specifically also as a member of the Global Apprenticeship Network. But before that, there's something I'd like to challenge in what you said. You said it's a model of learning. Well, to us, it's actually a model of working. Apprenticeships are a model of working. And why? Because one of the absolute preconditions to us is there needs to be a work contract for this to work. And this leads me to the last comment. To us, the model needs to be demand-led. So there needs to be that demand, that need by an employer. And the interesting part, and that's where the innovation comes in, is it always a company? We will have to see, but there needs to be this demand, there needs to be the work contract, and then the rest. This is obviously the perspective of the employer. Now, let me come to the challenges. And here, I would like to share that we summarize this in 5 C's. C. The first C, the biggest challenge, ladies and gentlemen, this is the private sector talking, it's costs. Apprenticeships cost. And the moment that we will be able to not talk about cost anymore, but about investment, we will have tackled part of the issue. Second challenge, capacity. And capacity has to do with the fact that a lot of employers, a lot of companies, a lot of those who want to do this work contract don't know how to actually do it. And that's why everything that has been mentioned is absolutely key. We need to provide the employers with all the tools so that they will know how to take on the apprentices. Third C, and this is an ugly one because I would prefer it to be a T as in talent, but it is the C for the cohorts. In other words, we talk about the apprentices, but actually many of us employers are struggling to find the young people or the apprentices. So the moment that the system will make sure, and probably here Switzerland is a wonderful example as well, and besides I'd like to add to the answer, if I may, of this morning, every kid in Switzerland starts school knowing he will do an apprenticeship. That mindset element is what leads to the success of the program. So coming back, the moment employers can tap into the talent, we will also have addressed one of the challenges. C number 4 is anything that has to do with the certifications, the credentials, the validation, the recognition. We know a lot of the big employers who run their own certification programs. There are, for companies that operate in various countries, there's all these systems. Well, how do you, match, recognize, validate? This is one to crack as well. In our case, as the Adecco Group, obviously we're one of the biggest employers in the world, but we help clients. Well, a nurse in Poland will not have the same qualifications as a nurse in Australia or in Germany. I don't need to tell you. And again, in certain countries there will be apprentices and in others not. Let me come to the 5th C, which is the communication side of apprenticeships, and that touches on what was mentioned already as well. It's the reputation, the image, and there we actually have a lot of convincing work still to do towards employers that this is a system and a model that has all the advantages that we all know of. So this summarizing 5 C's, and I'd like to leave it here, but I'll be happy to weave this back in the other topics. Thank you, Paul.
Great, thanks, Bettina. Some interesting points there for further discussion, I'm sure. Might just move on for this opening sort of salvo, as it were. Matthäus, can you have your views in response to that question? What are the key challenges that confront apprenticeship systems?
Yes, hello. Firstly, from my side, I'm happy to be here today, especially as we are speaking about apprenticeships and about young people. And I'm happy here to can bring in you the perspective of a young person, also someone who was doing an apprenticeship a few years ago. And if I can just directly respond to what Bettina was saying, I mean, as you're representing the employees and a bit a different perspective that I have to bring in today here, I want to say that for us as apprentices, the apprenticeship system is not only work. So within this professional education, you're still shaping not only workers, but you're still shaping citizens. And I strongly believe that we have to also here focus very much on citizen educationship, and we have to focus also on bringing into these young people the soft skills and also the social skills. So we cannot only focus on work and letting them work, and even sometimes just abusing this kind of education system as a cheap labor. This is also often the case we have in a lot of companies and a lot of countries, to say honestly. It's the same as with internships. But I'm representing here today the European Apprentices Network, and I want to just briefly introduce this network to you. We are 19 members right now from 12 different countries, so we are having all different backgrounds. And our slogan, and that's a bit the difference to the GAN we could hear today, is that we are by apprentices, for apprentices. So we are basically, all of us 19 people are young people who have done an apprenticeship or who are right now doing one, or who work like me as well for the trade unions or for organizations who work on the topic of apprenticeships. And speaking about the challenges for apprenticeship systems for the future, we have developed 7 key priorities within our network where we believe that young apprentices have the most challenges with. I would like to introduce you these 7 priorities shortly. So firstly, we believe that it's mostly important to have quality education. The labor market needs and wants young people who are very high educated. On the other side, they have to also deliver this education. This has to be delivered by the company or also by the schools, by the institutions where you learn it. Secondly, we're speaking about rights, responsibilities, and protections. We believe that especially young people, which are a vulnerable group, needs to have more protection than already an adult employee. Thinking about the ages, sometimes these are minors, so thinking about the working times, you cannot allow them, for example, to work for 8 or for 10 hours regarding to the country. You have to also watch out the breaks offering to these young people, and so on. So we need there way more protection of these young people. Thirdly, legally binding agreements. On one side, working contract, as is what we mentioned. So it has to be clearly stated out what the young person has to work or do at the company. And on the other side, we also need curricula where it's written down what this young person has to learn after this 2 or 3 years working apprenticeship programs. Number 4, and this is something very important for us as an apprentices network, is the representation. So it means we have to give these young people all over Europe in this case, but also on a local and regional level, the voice to be heard. They have to be supported when they have problems. They have to know who to go to when they have any issues at their working place. The 5th one is promoting apprenticeships. We believe that apprenticeship is a great alternative to studies, to higher education as well, and it proved in the last years that it's a smooth transition into the labor market. I'm coming basically from Germany, so in Germany you have apprenticeship systems in all different sectors of the labor market. So I know in a lot of countries it's mostly in the plumbing service, but or like the let's say handcrafted areas as well. In Germany you can do an apprenticeship in different offices, in the public service, speaking of the administration, in bank, so it's very much covered. And we believe that there there has to be more promotion of the systems and introduction of the systems in several sectors. Sixth is anti-discrimination. We want to fight against discrimination. And 7 is accessible information. And it's also important to have information before an apprenticeship. That means to have in schools, by teachers, the guidance that there are other options than just studies. Then you need information during your apprenticeship program and also afterwards. What are your possibilities later on? And here, thinking also about the challenges of the future, we just spoke a few days ago about it in another conference, how important it is to have more access to higher VET, to have a transition from a normal apprenticeship, normal VET, go then through higher VET, that we need way more opportunities there.
Great, thanks very much, Matthäus. I mean, you can see we're building up quite a list of challenges there, and what we actually get to in terms of responses will be interesting to see. But Lorna, could you add to the list, please?
Well, the problem of coming last is you do think everything's been said, so I'll try and add to that. Just on a quick personal note, I was reflecting this morning. I've done 2 apprenticeships. I left school a long time ago, at a time when in England you could do an apprenticeship in journalism. So you went straight from school into working on a local weekly newspaper, and I did a 2-year journalism apprenticeship. Today, journalism training is a postgraduate level training. And so I was reflecting this morning, I think one of the challenges apprenticeship faces is because it's competing with a shifting definition of what we mean by expertise. And that shifted over time. The speaker from Canada this morning spoke about a relative of hers who had gone into nurse training. And again, in the UK, for example, nurse training is now a graduate. Nursing is a graduate profession. When my sister-in-law trained to be a nurse in the 1960s, she entered nursing with a school leaving certificate. So our sense of what we mean by skill and how it changes, I think, is something we need to explore much more carefully, particularly because I'd relate that to 3 other challenges. The first one is technological and economic, and we've heard quite a lot about that this morning, about the issues around the 4th Industrial Revolution and so on. There's a very interesting book published at the start of the year by 2 British Labour economists called Capitalism Without Capital. And in it, they talk about intangible assets, the growth of investment by companies, private and public sector organisation in intangible assets. So these are ideas, how you network, customer capture, branding, intellectual property, and so on. And the investment in intangible assets is now as equal, if not starting to outstrip, investment in capital assets, roads, transport, infrastructure, hardware, buildings. So I think that's interesting, because what the authors of that book stress is that the shift to, and I think it links to your presentation, it's shifting to a mix of ideas about skill, which are very much that you need both the thinking skills, the creativity skills, as well as the practical skills. And that's going to be more and more important. And this, what they stress in this book, is that means investment in skills over the life course is going to be very important. So that's an issue, I think, where apprenticeship still tends to be seen as initial formation and a front-loaded initial formation. I think we need to link it much more to skills updating and so on. The second challenge, and it's connected to the technological and the economic, is the impact of all of that, changes in work, over probably the last 30 or so years on occupational identity. Because a key pillar of apprenticeship that is still very powerful, particularly for apprentices, but also perhaps for the general public, is about occupational identity. You are training, learning to become a named something. And I think in some current work I'm doing, what we're finding, talking particularly to young people, is the notion of occupation shifting because of their experiences in the workplace. So it's shifting from an occupational identity to a hybrid identity, where you say, I'm an electrician, but I'm also working in customer service, for example, to a fluid identity where people are talking more about the sector they work in, and then also an unspecified identity where young people are saying, I'm starting a business, I'm building a business. And they start with that rather than the notion of what it's actually in. And then thirdly, a generational shift. I think the concept of apprenticeship as a journey from a novice to a skilled worker needs really radically rethinking, because we know, and I know this from some research I've done with apprentices in workplaces in England, they're not novices when they come into their apprenticeship. We found through our research they actually are teaching their older colleagues a lot in the workplace, particularly obviously around IT, but also problem solving, ways to problem solve that mean you think outside the box. Interpersonal skills in particular. Young people are often denigrated for not having the right interpersonal skills. Actually, in the workplace, they have ways of dealing with people that I think can teach older workers a lot. So I think a key challenge for me is, rather than more top-down, this is what apprenticeship should be like, we need to move to much more of a co-production model. So we co-produce what kinds of apprenticeships are appropriate in what sectors, co-produce them with apprentices, with employers, and with vet teachers and trainers. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lorna. So, I think I've got the problem of time management. So I think, there's plenty that's been raised there and some really interesting sort of topics. But I'd like to throw it open to questions. But before doing that, maybe just if I could put the panellists on the spot and say, can you pick one of those challenges and give a solution in one sentence? And then we'll open it up to questions. Sorry to sort of frame it that way. So who would like to go first? Okay.
Yes, so I actually, because I've been thinking about the different points again, and to come back to the three challenges, the third one I think is indeed apprenticeships, evolving now a lot. The fact that we need more flexibility for apprenticeships to cater both for initial vocational in education training, but also for young people, but also for adults in a sort of continuous training context. And I think on flexibility, actually I have a good example of a recent Finnish reform. It's sort of entering into place this year. And what Finland is doing is they're actually putting together into one single entity both the IVET for young people and also CVET for adults in a lifelong context. So CVET, IVET into one single system with specific governance and financing arrangements, making it more flexible and moving from a supply-led to a more demand-led system. That's what you mentioned. And also being able to move even more and more fast towards learning outcomes, to a learning outcomes approach, which I know we're still discussing a lot, but sometimes in practice this hasn't been reached yet. So I think that's one good example of a more future-oriented system.
Yeah, great, thanks. So it's addressing the sort of governance arrangements within a lifelong learning framework to reposition apprenticeships, as an option for different groups. Another issue, another hand. Bettina, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'll be very happy to share, obviously, that there are solutions out there to the challenges that I was able to put forward. And they've been reflected notably via reforms. We've seen that in France, for instance. It was indicated already. In our view, this is one of the countries that's really looking to push and take the best of many worlds into the system. What's really been a game changer in our view, and where we think we will reach scalability as well, is in having the intermediaries that you mentioned. So it won't surprise you there. But that both helps on this sourcing question, so you have expert companies, workforce solution companies that are able to, find, but it also helps on the capacity side. So they develop models that help the employers, but that also bring together all the key stakeholders. And I'd like to very, very strongly pick up on the co-production side of things. In our view, this is the key to the model in itself. It requires for all to be sitting at the table. I probably resonate there as well. So this example to showcase in France specifically, we have examples of other countries where this role of intermediaries seems to be a success factor when it is applied well. And clearly, when certain preconditions are given, I think in the ILO context is qualified under, the quality apprenticeship. So.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks for that. I think that issue about local kind of solutions for local labour markets and picking up on the idea of skills ecosystems where people are addressing labour market issues at a local level, there's no reason why apprenticeship shouldn't be part of that process as well. Lorna, can I ask you?
Yeah, I wanted to challenge you and say that's the wrong question. You said, what's the solution? Can you name one solution? Well, there isn't. If there was, we'd all come up with it. We'd all be very rich because governments around the world would be paying us millions to tell them what the secret was. There isn't one solution. It's very hard. I think it's really important to say that. Every country in the world that has formal systems of apprenticeship, every country in the world has a form of apprenticeship, because I think, as you said at the beginning, it's an age-old model of learning. It's a kind of natural human way to pass on skills and expertise. But every country that formalises its apprenticeship system faces big challenges, and a lot of those we heard about this morning, particularly in terms of the nature of countries' economies and how regulated the labour markets are, and so on. So I think the solutions we have to keep working at, and I do think we have to work closely with what's happening in workplaces. One of the current projects I'm doing is comparing aerospace engineering apprentices in England and Germany. And what we're trying to do is look at, and those are two systems that are often seen at the polar end of the quality extreme. But in aerospace engineering, when you look at the content of a German and an English apprenticeship, they're very, very similar, almost identical. what we looked at was whether there were pedagogical differences. And what we found was that the standardisation in the aerospace industry, the technical standardisation across the industry internationally, which is particularly around safety, obviously, is actually having a big impact on pedagogical convergence. So what you find in both countries, in aerospace companies, is very interesting, innovative pedagogical development going on because it reflects what's happening in the workplace. More project-based working, teams. So the way work's organised, I think it will give us a lot of clues as to how to rethink or help develop apprenticeship.
Thanks, Lorna. I mean, the idea of globalisation as a driver of quality within apprenticeships is interesting, particularly when you talk about the growth of qualification frameworks and world reference levels or whatever else in terms of standardisation. But Matthäus, do you want to have a crack?
Yeah, this time I'm the last. As I'm trade unionist by heart, I would say that representation for us is something we have to work on because it's not only about speaking about apprentices, but it's also speaking with apprentices. And I believe that so the young person who has done an apprenticeship recently or doing it right now, we know what is working well in the systems, but we also know what are the challenges and what is not working very well. And I know, for example, from Slovenia, there's something like so-called youth inspectors. So these are young people who are revising the curricula from the educational institutions and also revising the working contracts, so checking also like the social rights. And this is also something we have to work on if we want to promote or a bit more apprenticeships.
Very good. Thank you, panellists, and thanks for your flexibility with the format there. I think it's time now to open it up to some questions, and I can see some hands going up. So please, madam, if you could introduce yourself and the question. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny Lambert from the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I'd like to buy into a couple of the initial exchange. Is it a contract of work or a contract of training? And I'd like to buy into the issue of is it an initial skills development or how does that relate to lifelong? I think the first thing is that we've seen the essence of the strength of apprenticeship is that it does have a contract of employment and structured training with a contract attached to it, with a qualification outcome, which is part of a system, which is recognised to the extent that it can be recognised within an overall system, and an industrial framework that provides an apprenticeship or trainee wage and a series of conditions around it that reflects the fact that when people initially come in, whether they're from school or with no experience, are paid in accordance to their productivity when they commence and the extent to which they're doing structured training off the job. So it's the combination of those three things in our view, which is the essence of what makes apprenticeship model so strong. That is why we don't necessarily see apprenticeships as the model for the ongoing work. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be available for people in a lifelong sense who are switching careers, so it's still an initial way of acquiring skills. But what's one solution to potentially put on the table today would be that we should consider the apprenticeship system as part of the overall vocational training approach to how we upskill workers within existing workplaces. In Australia, for a period of time, we had what's called a workforce development fund, which provided government subsidy support for companies. It varied according to size, so much less subsidy for large business, much more subsidy for small business, to provide formal qualifications to upskill employees. We never delivered it properly. We never interacted it with the apprenticeship system. But I think there's a solution there that if we see the two things in operation together, there's a potential to deliver upskilling and also to continue to formalise and reinforce the apprenticeship network. Thanks.
Yeah, up the back, the young lady. Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Oh.
I have. Sorry.
Okay, well, go for it, mate. You got the microphone. No, carry on. We'll take yours next. Okay, madam. Yep. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Sian Cook. I'm from the Department for Education in England, and I'm really interested because we're currently in the middle of a massive reform programme of how apprenticeships are paid for and delivered in the UK. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, for us is communicating the quality of that training, whether it be on the job or off the job, which leads us into this conversation we're having about parity of esteem with the academic routes as well. So I was wondering if the panel has any views on how we can measure and better communicate the quality of training that is going on in different sorts of institutions delivering that training.
Okay, thanks. So we'll take a few questions and then come back to the panellists to respond to the points that they feel they'd like to. Sir, you had your hand up earlier, please.
Bazargan from University of Tehran. I have two questions. The first is posed to the panel in general. I see the definition of entrepreneurship, which is being laid out in 1962 by ILO. Let me read it, and then I bring three concepts from it. It says, systematic long-term training for a recognized occupation taking place substantially within an undertaking or under an independent craftsman should be governed by a written contract of apprenticeship and the subject to established standards. The three concepts that I see here, the craftsman, the contract, and the established standards, I ask the panels whether all these three are being considered in your definition at the national level. If yes, then I ask the Professor Unwin how the university has taken the apprenticeship with this definition as a part of higher education and academic program. That is the first question. The second question is related to Madame Schaller. She has pointed to 5 C's, which is very important. One of them is the capacity. Have you had any experience with regard to capacity building at the national level? What are those? And with regard to the 5th C, communication, there are cultures in which when you talk about the craftsmanship and entrepreneurship, they said, oh, gee, forget about it. It's not really of importance. If you don't have anything to do, okay, come on, start something. How this really has been considered as an important issue within the cultural setting, especially in developing countries, where if you think of the NQF, which if you look at the specific definition as this craftsman is talking about, it is just within the first and the second level of the NQF. Thank you.
Okay, we have a hand up the back, please.
Hi, this is Asaduzzaman, Prime Minister's Office, Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, we are expanding apprenticeship program all over the country. So I have a question to Mr. Fandrejewski that in Bangladesh, we have introduced apprenticeship program in formal sectors. Side by side, 80% of our economy depends on informal sector. That's why just 3 or 4 years back, we have started apprenticeship program in informal workplaces. So I need your guidance, actually, how we can formalize the informal apprenticeship program, that means the apprenticeship program in informal sectors, because it's needed. You will be happy to know that we already have partnership with BIT, Behavioral Science Team, UK. They are supporting us in this regard. So also the European Apprenticeship Network and the other experts can guide us how we can formalize the informal apprenticeship into formal sectors. Thank you very much.
Maybe one more. Ephraim, please.
I'm from the Iranian mission. First of all, thank you so much for the enlightening remarks. You know, as the ILO is the house of the labor standards, I mean the recommendations, conventions, and protocols, it would be useful if we could touch upon the apprenticeship from this aspect as well. You might be aware that the Standard Review Mechanism Working Group in the ILO has identified a gap on apprenticeship, on standards relating to apprenticeship. Having said that, do you see this lack of instrument as a challenge? Or in that case, I wonder if the panelists could maybe mention some of the most important elements that should be incorporated into a possible instrument in this respect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for those questions. They cover a fair bit of ground. Some of them were directed to individual panelists. Bettina, do you want to?
Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure, and I think we should extend this another hour. Yeah, I think it's a brilliant session. We're just getting started here. No, but thank you for your questions indeed, and maybe I'll just pick 5 or 6. No, I'll pick 1 or 2. So on the communication, and that's why it was posed as a challenge. Obviously, again, we have not cracked that nut yet. You know, in the world we live in, perception is reality, and unless you talk about something, and then there's a matter of also what instruments you use to talk about it. If your way of talking about it is, I apologize, a 200-page ILO report, I will read it with greatest interest, but it might not actually make it out there on the street. So probably, you know, my comment here would be campaigning, and then just using all the tools that are out there today. And also, again, picking up on this necessity to have everybody involved. Obviously, I'm sitting here with one hat, but I have many hearts. The employers need to campaign, but the apprentices need to do the same. And then, you know, those governments or frameworks where it works need to do as well. So it's a little bit of a concerted action and campaigning which is needed here. I guess that would be my answer to this one. Then if I may, I'm looking at my co-panelists, but so on the capacity building, you know, I have been amazed over the years to witness how many incredible programs there are out there to support just about everybody. I know the European Alliance for Apprenticeships is one initiative. Being a Swiss national myself, but I also see the Austrians and the Germans who are carrying out numerous bilateral capacity building programs. There are numerous institutions out there. So if anything, I don't think we have an issue with capacity building programs per se or as it is, but we have a problem with impact, you know, of those, and the models are still not out there. So my answer there would be the programs are there. Is it efficiency? Is it just the complexity again of the overall? Is it maybe time to, you know, bring some together? Clearly, our engagement in the Global Apprenticeship Network, you know, is our way of responding to that, because we feel that this is the public-private partnership program that does bring those threads together and that looks at impact where, you know, we think it is, which is at country level. Again, the European Alliance for Apprenticeships has a similar model, but this is where the input I'd like to give to that one. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I pass to Lorna, because there was a question there specifically about the implementation of apprenticeships in the higher education sector, and I think certainly from within the ILO, you know, we're looking at different country experiences in this regard with particular interest, because I think it has the potential to address a number of, you know, these challenges that have been articulated. But coming back to this question of, you know, what exactly is an apprenticeship, and in terms of a model of learning versus a structured program, you know, for entry level or some other form of continuing professional development. I mean, how you're from the sector, how are universities kind of responding to this question of higher level, or this push for higher level apprenticeships in the UK? You know, at the same time, themselves recognising the value of work-integrated learning, work-based learning degrees. You know, are we looking at a convergence, or we're looking at some sort of, you know, maintenance of this distinction between, well, apprenticeships is only for these types of occupations or not? I mean, how do you picture that?
Easy question. Golly. Yeah. Higher education will colonise wherever it can. So beware of what universities see as the next opportunity. Having said that, a great deal of the best higher education in a number of countries, and this would be true of the UK, is apprenticeship in nature. It's work-based. So in the UK, for example, architecture degrees, medicine, accountancy, I could go on, are very work-based now. They've been shifting over the years from a very academic, classroom-based model to more and more work-based opportunities. So this characterization of, you know, higher education as academic learning also needs to be, you know, problematized. In the UK, we have higher apprenticeships, which we've had for a few years, which started out offering sub-degree level qualifications, and now we have degree apprenticeships, which are popular with big companies, particularly big accountancy companies, for example, who are recruiting 18-year-olds with very good upper secondary qualifications straight into an accountancy apprenticeship where you do time at university and you do time in the workplace. I think there's room for that. My fear is that the focus on that, and it's partly to do with the question about parity of esteem, will squeeze out attention to the intermediate skill level, the kind of traditional base of apprenticeship. And in the UK, that's where we lack skills, a lot of skills, at what we call levels 3, 4 and 5, so going up to sub-degree. So I think we have to watch that as higher education colonises this space, and it will do, it actually understands apprenticeship, and it links back to, I think, your question about standards and the question from Australia about what an apprenticeship is. Because higher level apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships in the UK, I think there are questions to be asked about the nature of the employment contract and so on. So what I don't want to see is credentialism, you know, turning apprenticeship into yet another course.
Great, thanks, Lorna. Helen, would you like to respond, please?
Thanks. Well, in fact, there are 3 points I'd like to get back to that were raised by the audience, and also just illustrate with 1 or 2 slides that I have prepared. So, and I could do that, all of that in under 2 minutes. It's just to give you a very quick overview of where we stand on the issue of the challenges. Yeah. And that's still before the coffee break, so I'll keep things short now. This is really just to come back quickly to the issue that was raised earlier on the standards and the social protection. So, in fact, one of the key challenges in Europe is about member states expanding their apprenticeship systems, improving them, etc. And of course, this bears a risk of, let's say, impeding on the quality and also effectiveness. and based on calls coming from the European Parliament to have a better common understanding of what quality apprenticeships are, but also from the European Court of Auditors, which monitors the EU budget and, for example, the youth guarantee and how it's implemented. So based on many of these calls, we came up with the European Framework for Quality and Effective Apprenticeships. This also builds very much on input from member states and social partners. And the actual, final text was adopted in March this year. It's available in all EU languages, also, for example, Spanish and Portuguese. And member states now have 3 years to implement it. And why I'm raising this is it's about the social protection and standards. So we have in total 14 criteria. 7 of them are about having good learning and working conditions in place. And for example, this includes the issue of social protection, but also pay and/or compensation for the workplace component of the training. And it also, the aim is, of course, also to have a common definition of apprenticeships. So these are the 7 criteria for the learning and working conditions. We also have another 7 for the framework conditions, and Paul mentioned, for example, EQF, NQF, better illustrating the level of an apprenticeship on a European scale from 1 to 8. How it compares to higher education or other education and training pathways. So this is one of the key criteria, but it's also support for companies, non-financial and financial, which are often regarded as equally important and sometimes financially even more, especially for small enterprises. So these are the 14 criteria. There's a link at the end where you can read up on the detail. What I'd just like to say is a final comment, and that's if the technology allows me. Yes, it's really about the next steps. So having agreed a bit these success factors of what good apprenticeships are, and knowing also our, let's say, limited competences that we have at EU level, we will launch some apprenticeship support services in the autumn, actually in the context of the European Vocational Skills Week in Vienna, which is very much aimed at highlighting good practices and excellence in VET. It's a European-wide communication campaign. We will also celebrate 5 years of the European Alliance for Apprenticeships there, which is our sort of multi-stakeholder platform at EU level to improve the quality, supply, and also image and mobility in apprenticeships. So anyway, the support services will have 3 pillars. One is a knowledge hub, sharing information with participants, evidence, statistics. It's also about networking, identifying, clusters of common issues and how to address them. And the third one, and I think perhaps the most interesting one, is on bench learning. So it comes from the public employment services and what they're doing at the moment to compare different member states and, let's say, the effectivity of how they deliver let's say, jobs for people or to help with getting people into the labor market. And the idea is to identify certain indicators combining the peer learning, but also the sort of more benchmarking in a very structured approach. So these are just some points that I wanted to mention, and you'll find, further reading material under the links that I've provided. Thanks, yeah.
Thanks very much, Helen. There's some interesting examples of how, international efforts, if you like, responding to some of those challenges. Finally, I'd like to ask Matthäus to respond.
As we have not so much time anymore, I would like to respond only to the colleague from Bangladesh who just directly addressed the question to me. A very tricky question, to be honest, because transforming informal education to formal education is something that we also, as the European Youth Forum, for example, we are claiming for a long time already, because we are learning in this, within informal education, a lot of skills that we can use in our professional life later on, and we believe that it has to be anyhow recognized, all the informal education that we get through our volunteering work, for example. And I think that there could be something developed like common standards in the countries where you could also like benchmark qualifications, and then they have to be anyhow recognized by the labor market as a qualification at the end as well.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think that highlights the importance of recognition of prior learning systems within apprenticeships, particularly for adult learners and within the framework of lifelong learning. I'd like to take the opportunity to respond to the question about standards as well, because it was sort of posed directly to us. For those of you that don't know, there has been a review of the normative arrangements governing apprenticeships within the tripartite framework of the ILO and the International Labour Conference, and a regulatory gap has been identified, and basically there are discussions underway amongst our constituents about the best way to respond to that. Whether or not there will be what's called a standard setting discussion and a new international labour standard or an instrument, normative instrument that's developed, has yet to be determined, which means that the discussions between our social partners are ongoing. But I think certainly from a technical perspective, we would welcome such a discussion, because I think some of the issues that have been raised today around the scope of apprenticeships, around how you actually define an apprenticeship, would be welcome, and I think our constituents would benefit from further guidance on how apprenticeship should be considered within a broader framework of labour market institutions and education and training programs. So I hope that that responds to your query. So I guess it's just left to me to say thank you very much to the panel. I think we had an interesting discussion, and I hope audience members got something out of it too. So I'd ask you to join in showing your appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Comyn, for the moderation, and thank you for a very, very interesting, excellent panel. Really, thank you so much. I think we all appreciated that. Now we're going to move into session 4. We're going from theory into practice, and we're going to have several examples being mentioned and discussed. We have a moderator coming up here too. Welcome. Anthony Mann, who is a Senior Policy Advisor for Vocational Education and Adult Learning, OECD. And this session will also be followed by question and answer. And I want to remind you again that we don't have so much time for all questions, it seems like. So don't hesitate to, in the coffee pause or later tonight in the reception, discuss, talk to people, ask your questions. They are here to be interacted with them. So I think we're getting the new panel here. What I thought especially interesting in this panel was, and I think this is coming back over and over again, how do you define apprenticeship? What is it? What is it we're talking about? And maybe they will also actually address this in the next panel. I think they're all taking their places. After this session, number 4, we will have a coffee break. Probably I will ask you to keep it short too, like this morning, because we're running 15 minutes after the schedule. So we will give them an hour, and then we have a 15 minutes coffee break, same place as this morning. Okay, are you all ready? Let's start. Welcome.
To give the
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. The gentleman who's standing up?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to lend my microphone to this gentleman, and I hope he's going to give it back to me, because he wants to walk around when he talks, and hopefully he will give it back to me afterwards. So, sorry, you wanted to have the microphone?
Yeah.
Right. Here it is.
Thank you.
It's on. You can leave it on, and then you talk.
Thank you very much. So nice of you.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you. We will move on to our next session because we're kind of aware of the time. I think it's important to have as much time as possible for discussion because we have some really fascinating and interesting discussions coming from the floor, but also in the time we have for breaks. I'm Anthony Mann. I work for the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, where I head up a team which is responsible for VET. We undertake policy-focused research in this area. I won't say much about that, except that career guidance is something which has come up quite a bit today. And on Friday, we'll be publishing an evidence review on career guidance, which I think people may well be interested in. It's be available from 10 o'clock on Friday. If you Google OECD VET, VET, you should be able to find that without too much trouble. And I want to just say thank you to the organisers. I think this is a really fabulous programme. I'm really impressed. I think there's some people I've been wanting to hear from years who are here, the richness of the conversations. I would say there are more stars in participating today than there are in Hollywood. I really would. And I think on this panel, we have 5 of the brightest stars. They are going to be talking about their own individual experiences of effective examples of initiatives to strengthen apprenticeships. So we're going to have 5 rather different presentations. So in terms of organisation, what I thought would work best is that we'll ask each of our speakers to talk for about 6 minutes, and then we'll take a couple of questions. Because they're going to be talking about rather different things rather than saving things till the end. And so if we do that, I want to sort of jump in and ask our first speaker to begin. Our first speaker is Ashwani Aggarwal. He says in his biography that he's worked in more than 50 countries, which I believe, but over 34 years. I think Ashwani has the kind of the energy and passion of somebody in their 20s, and he obviously works here at the ILO. And Ashwani, can I ask you to begin this session?
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, everyone. You are great and very passionate people. We can see you are looking as fresh as you were in the morning, despite so many presentations. But I am not as, energetic as you. So please allow me to stand up and speak. Basically, in this 6 minutes presentation, which is quite impossible given the nature of the topic, I will touch upon briefly on 3 points only. Why ILO should take initiatives to promote quality apprenticeships. What are those initiatives? I will touch only the most important one, not all of them, and just briefly mention the impact of some of those. So let me start with, first of all, let me share one real incident with you. Real incident with you. We received a request from Ministry of Labour from one of the African countries to support in the reforming apprenticeship system. A very usual request, which is normally the starting point for ILO to provide support. But what was the unusual part of it? 3 big development agencies have already committed more than $100 million to support skills development for the same year, starting in nearly the same year. And it is a small country with less than 20 million population. So I asked them, what is the reason why you want us also to jump into this one? And they said a very, very simple and passionate answer. They said that we have observed the impact of ILO's program in other African countries, and we want to replicate those. So we are not asking you to provide financial support. Financial support we are taking from others. You come and provide the technical support. And here, some other countries there, from secretary from the Tanzania is there. I think he will also say the same things, that even if you don't have the money, you will say, ILO, you never go back. Is it correct? Exactly. Thank you. So this is the reason when the constituents demand so much from the ILO, we have to work in that field, because that is what ILO is, that government, employers, and workers. Now coming to what are the recent initiatives? Is it working? Okay. So basically, let me just first show this slide, which shows during recent years, in how many countries we have provided support. There are more than 40 countries. You can see these are spread across the globe. And what we provide support? we support tripartite constituents in developing customized solutions. If you see, I have emphasized 2 points. One is on the customized solutions as per their requirement, as per their conditions. And second is important aspect is that we provide support, we do not lead. We provide support to the tripartite constituents who themselves develop. We help them developing the right solutions for themselves. And of course, these depends upon the case. It could be policy and systems development. It could be capacity development. For example, this conference. And similarly, this year we organized a regional African conference in Kenya. And there is a plan to organize one in Asia towards the end of this year or next year. So these are the examples, pilot programs we run. Then we also collaborate with other development partners. For example, you can see in this conference also, we are collaborating with OECD, GAN. We also collaborate with the European Commission, European Union also, European Apprenticeship Network, UNESCO, and other bodies also. So we want to work together in collaboration with many other agencies. And we also were one of the promoters of the GAN. I think she will speak more about that one. Now what we also do, we develop innovative knowledge products and approaches. Here I will mention only one of them, which was developed very recently. This is an ILO toolkit for quality apprenticeship, about which the Director General mentioned in the morning, and also the Permanent Secretary from the Indian government who also mentioned about that one in the morning. What is the unique thing about this one? The unique thing about this one is that it's a very practical hands-on guide for policymakers, and it's suitable for all types of countries, developed or developing. Because we have taken a lot of care. Normally what happens, if you talk about apprenticeship, what examples come to the mind? 1 or 2 countries, Germany, Switzerland, or maybe 1 or 2 more countries. But here we have taken care, because normally whenever we go to a country, developing country, they always ask us, please give us examples from similar context countries. So there are more than 400 examples from about 50 countries covering all regions and income levels. For example, next chart will show you the breakup of the countries from different regions. There are 21% of the countries are from Africa. You can never think that so many countries from Africa can give some good examples of apprenticeships from Americas, Asia, and Europe. Now, I think last panel, Bettina, she also mentioned about some of the ILO report, 200 pages, not readable. I think we already, where she is? Or maybe she has left. Sorry? No, it's a true point. That's what I'm showing the next slide. We already sense these things. That's why you can see we are already in the pipeline of developing apps. So that means in the future, there will be no more print copies. Everything we are translating into apps, so that on your mobile, when you're sitting, you can keep on using that one and learning also. And also, what is this one? Because I will not touch upon, because there's no time is short. But for us, this quality apprenticeship is part of the broader program for the work-based learning, because different countries have different conditions. Like Bangladesh asked, there's a large informal economy, so many things may not work. So what we have done, we started with informal apprenticeship. We developed a guide on informal apprenticeship. Then this current guide has come, toolkit. Then we are already developing another one, which is to design and implement program. And the next one would be a lot of demand coming on internship, various different type of work-based learning program. Let's show, one of the leaders in Africa said, for him, the impact of the program is when it changes the life of the ordinary people. So, 2 months ago when I was in Tanzania, I received a call from the chief executive of the Hotel Association of Tanzania. She said, have you seen today's morning newspaper? And she said, there's a very big article on one of the graduates. This person is one of the first graduates from the first program. He's currently working in a very big, the Sun City group, which is the largest group and best group in Africa, as a chef. At the age of, now he's 30 years old. 4 years of, and he's having a qualification level of level 5. People are talking about this qualification level 1 or 2, but he's a qualification 5. And what he was a casual worker, school dropout, and who was used to sell fish on the roadside. He undergone this program, and now he's acting as a chef, and he already has a plan to start his own Chef's Academy for other persons. These are also some other examples of from Tanzania. But with this one, and this last slide is my colleague from Costa Rica has sent, where the president of the Costa Rica has given an award to the ILO for providing good services in establishing apprenticeship system. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ashwani, for that whistle-stop tour through some of the work of the ILO. Do we have any immediate question for Ashwani? In which case, I will take the prerogative of the chair and ask you, Ashwani, in looking at so many different apprenticeships, in thinking about how toolkits can be really used, we have certain things which are universal and certain things which are particular. And I guess what would you highlight as being some of the most important universal characteristics of the most effective practice which you see?
See, for most important first, characteristics is that it must be based on the real demand, and it should address the demand. And when you are developing it, it should be in collaboration with those who are going to use it, because at that stage, their inputs will be there. And if you are basically addressing the demand, utilizing them, and also putting in the real work, your expertise, in that one, it has to be a mix of, you can't just copy some examples. Something comes from intuition, something comes from sixth sense, many things you have to interpret, your own experience, your own pilot programs. It has to be end result of some kind of a long implementation of pilot programs, successful programs. You cannot just, it's not academic research where you can just copy paste something. So most important thing is successful programs, and based on those programs, putting those things in a paper form.
Excellent, thank you. Our second speaker of this session is Boren Shakarun from UNESCO, Chief of Youth of Literacy and Skills Development, and somebody who brings huge amounts of experience and insight into this question. So, Boren, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anthony, and I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank, of course, colleagues at ILO for the invitation. I learned that when you have 6 minutes, you rather start with the takeaway, and then you try to present unless the chair will stop you. So let me start with the takeaway of my presentation. There are 3 takeaways that I would like to highlight. The first one is that apprenticeship has to be placed in a lifelong learning perspective. It's not only about jobs, it's also about lifelong learning. And I didn't brief the Director General of ILO, because he mentioned that, but I didn't brief him for that. But I think it's very important, and I was positioning my presentation on apprenticeship in a lifelong learning perspective, and I will explain an element of that. The second, that technology is putting a new requirement on apprenticeship, on workplace learning, on the world of work, but it can be also an enabler for improving apprenticeship and improving the quality of apprenticeship. And I think it's important that we take that into consideration. And the third takeaway is that we have to drop the myth of looking for one model of apprenticeship. There is no one model of apprenticeship. And we cannot have a standardized approach for apprenticeship. We have a variety of apprenticeship. What should be common is the rights. Is the right of learners, is the right of workers. That's what has to be respected and protected, but not a model that will be called X or Z. And these are the 3 takeaways that I wanted to highlight in my presentation. Now, just very quickly, for us, apprenticeship and work-based learning has to be placed in the Sustainable Development Agenda. And it's about education, is about inclusive economic growth and decent work, but it can be also about gender equality and other aspects that are part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And that has a perspective on apprenticeship. In the work I've done with other colleagues, we were looking at TVET from 3 lenses: the economic, the social, and the sustainability. And I think we can apply it to apprenticeship. Apprenticeship has an economic lens. It has an important economic dimension, but it has also social equity, because it can drive better social justice, it can support social progression. But it has to be also sustainable and environmentally respectful. We don't want apprentices that will harm the world where we are living. So we have to have this combination. And we use the metaphor of lenses to say that at one point of time, you may have priority to some aspect, but you have to keep this broad three element. And we are borrowing them from the three pillars of the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is about economy, social equity, and sustainability. We have heard this morning, and we have all the evidence that the labor market is changing, and we have polarization of the labor market, and we have the middle skills jobs that are disappearing, starting from high-income countries, but we know that is also the case in low and middle-income countries. So we have evidence of the changes of the labor market, and this should support our argument for lifelong learning. We have also evidence that apprentices are lacking basic skills, including in the most advanced systems in the world, in dual system or apprenticeship system. So we know that apprentices are lacking foundation skills that will support their lifelong learning. We also know that this is the case in many countries in the world, and here I refer to the PASEC. This is part of the African surveys, and I'm sorry if the quality of the slide is not good. But we know that students or young learners, when they finish the school, they are not acquiring the skills that they should acquire at the end of the school. And they enter the apprenticeship or TVET with a lack of skills to continue learning and to learn well. We also know that it's important to enhance the traditional apprenticeship, and that in many countries in the world, that's the way people are learning. But also that it's outside of the formal, and that it has to be, and the Bangladesh colleagues were referring to that, it has to be engaged in a form of recognition and certification that will valorize the learning that those people will have. But it can offer also a wide opportunities for people to engage in lifelong learning. We also know that the internal effectiveness of apprenticeship is low. We have high dropout rate in apprenticeship. In Britain, in Australia, but also in other countries in the world, for example, in Western Africa. So the young people, when they come to apprenticeship, they don't like it, they do drop. And that means that there is a need for more support and more coaching. And that leads me to the three elements that I think are important to position apprenticeship in lifelong learning. First of all, we have to reinforce the apprentices' foundation and 21st century skills. And that comes, of course, in the workplace, but that also requires better quality of the job learning. And unfortunately, in many countries in the world, of the job learning is very weak quality when it happens. So we have to ensure that all apprentices have and to develop a strong basic foundation skills. We have to recognize the learning that is acquired, and it's not necessarily full qualifications. We know that there are possibilities for people to recognize part of the certificate, part of the qualification and micro-credentials, and that's what can help apprentices accumulate different type of learning outcomes and make them recognizable. And here the technology can be helpful and can support the way we recognize those skills. And last and not least, and Anthony was referring to that, career guidance and counseling. It's amazing if we have 30% of apprentices dropping, that means there is a problem. And part of the problem can be the workplace itself, but can be also the choice. And how to support that choice is an important policy matter and an important policy intervention. We are working on those three areas. First of all, we are trying to support countries in improving of the job learning, because we think that's a very important aspect, and we are doing that in Western Africa, we're doing that in Middle East and North Africa. On the certification, and to respond to the Bangladesh colleagues, a country like Benin, a country like Togo have been introducing very innovative approach to introduce new certifications for apprentices, recognizing the prior learning of master craftsmen and apprentices. And I think there are good examples to learn from, and we have to share that. And career guidance and counseling, the technology can help us, because the technology, the apps can help, but it's not only app, it can be other forms of mobile, because some of the people do not have access to the 4G or 3G, but basic technology can help also. And we have examples in many countries that are using career guidance and counseling, and we are working on mobile technology to support learners and apprentices. But the technology can help also in digitizing the resources that apprentices are using, other tools that are the liaison between the workplace and the school or of the job learning. So I think it's important that we position apprenticeship in this perspective, and these are the 3 pillars that we are working on now. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. I feel really mean. Can I ask, do we have any questions across this very broad area which Borin has described? Gentleman here first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this. Well, I've listened to the last 2 groups of input about reforming apprenticeship, and now it's coming up with these effective examples. I'm not too sure whether we can agree with everything. I was a bit curious that ILO may be representative of the tripartite organizations. Of course, your reach out program can be as effective as you want it to be. So in order to get a buy-in for whatever effective systems you want to have and to revamp apprenticeship, are we all coming from ground zero? Apprenticeship is not yesterday, you know. So I got the impression that are we painting a picture that we're coming from ground zero and we need to overhaul this, and what has been the best practices that we had. I'm just curious to know that how much outreach program do you have in order to write some of these conclusions, because certainly I hope that there must be buy-in at the end of this exercise when you come in to propose some of the effective solutions. And even if you want to, you use this word, reforming, you want to reform all this thing, obviously there must be good reasons you want to reform it. And the funding for ILO is from various stakeholders. I believe there must be adequate consultation with stakeholders of where we are going and what we want out of this. Earlier this morning, I mentioned about how the younger generations have responded to apprenticeship, whether it's the branding or whether you want this label to work. I think we need to analyze that, because we do not want to go head on and build a monster that we didn't want to have. So I have some concerns on this area, and whatever model we want is not one size fits all. And for all stakeholders, I know that you have as much reach out program as you have, but certainly you may not reach out to everybody in the globe. There's a lot of silent majority who listens, and also who actually heard about ILO, who practices ILO principles, conventions, very good ones, and also not so good ones. Sometimes it may not meet their expectations. At this stage, I think I'd just like to exercise some caution. Where are we heading? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I'll ask Boran if you want to sort of come back, I suppose, in this question about the rationale for reform, and then Ashwani, if you've got anything to add, and then we'll move on to our next presentation.
I would share, of course, the word of caution, but I think the scale of the disruption requires also a big attention from our side. I showed some slides about the change in the labor market, but we know also, and I dropped some of the slides, we know that the potential for the disruption is much higher than what is happening now, meaning there are some government decisions that are slowing down a form of disruption. There are other forms of government or other stakeholders' decisions that are reducing still yet the impact of the changes. But there are changes, there will be change in the labor market. And for example, the lack of the middle skilled jobs can have implication on the apprenticeship and on what we are saying, like the coaching and the tutoring. We are going for a polarization where most probably we will have high-end skills and low-end skills. And then the question is how these two layers can communicate and who will be the liaison. So I agree with the word of caution that you are highlighting, and obviously there are well-settled systems that will not change in one night. But I think that the scale of the change in the labor market requires that we start thinking proactively on how the things will happen and what government have to take as actions.
And Ashwani?
Okay. I think you mentioned very important point. No one size fits all, and the involvement of social partners. If you kindly just recall when I was making the presentation, I emphasized on two aspects clearly. That when we ILO work in a country, first is we support the tripartite constituents, means government, employers, and workers. Help build their capacity, help them analyze the current situation. Based on their analysis, what are the things to be done? Then I emphasize customized solutions, that we help them develop customized solutions for them. So it could be very different for even two neighboring countries, or even within one country, within one region to another region, it could be a different solution. I agree with you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to keep going, but Lorna, did you have a quick point to make?
Yes.
If it's a quick point, we can take it, and then we'll have to move on to our next presentation.
Yes, my question is with regard to UNESCO. As you know, that 2030 has 17 objectives, one of them the SDG 4. Now, I ask UNESCO to see to what extent with ILO has been interacting with regard to this apprenticeship program. Has there been any connection? Is there going to be any program? I think there is need for combination of the two so that the SDG 4 could be really strengthened in that regard. Thank you.
Okay. And a quick response?
Well, my presence is an example of that, but I agree that we have to do more. We have an interagency group where the ILO and UNESCO are sitting together and trying to advance the agenda. For example, on digital, we have developed a joint work-based learning leaflet and resources. We are working in the Middle East and North Africa on developing work guides that are serving. So we are trying to work together, but the governance of the two agencies are different, and I think that's one of the aspects that we have to take into consideration. And definitely this is an element that sometimes can slow down the cooperation.
All right. Thank you. I know there's lots of people do want to get in, but what we'll do is hopefully we'll have some more time at the end, because I do think it's important that we try and make sure that all our speakers have at least their 10 minutes to be able to talk to you and respond to questions. So our third speaker today is Shay Gopal, who many of you will know is the Executive Director of the Global Apprenticeship Network, for whom this is a sort of homecoming, returning to the ILO, where she spent some important time working. Shay, it's over to you.
And it's actually, it's so fascinating to be in this room and to hear so much wealth of information. So I really thank ILO for bringing together so many different people. The Global Apprenticeship Network was set up in 2013, and we are in action out of the G20, B20. This is when the economic crisis was so bad that youth unemployment was at the highest levels ever, and business, it was felt, needed to be part of the solution in finding apprenticeships, work readiness programs as a solution for youth unemployment. Our mandate is to get companies to commit to more apprenticeships, to share their best practices, to advocate for apprenticeships. Prior to setting up the Global Apprenticeship Network, I did a study for the ILO. I went to 7 different countries. I interviewed over 120 employers. There's no question about it, the stigma was the biggest problem. Not only in developing countries, but also in the US, in Switzerland, in Germany. So we still take that rather seriously. And also we do one last thing, was facilitate multi-stakeholder dialogue. In order to get change, you have to go local. And so we've been setting up throughout the world local networks. So where are we? When we started out, we thought we were going to mainly be in developing countries. We are demand-driven, and based on both some fortunate funding from the ILO, the MasterCard Foundation, and the US Department of Labor, we've been able to go into countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi, South Africa, Argentina, Costa Rica. The other networks in our first model were started by employers' federations. One of our key partners is IOE. They represent 156 different employers' federations throughout the world. And each one of those employers' federations represents sometimes, like in Indonesia, 14,000 companies. So we started in Turkey at the G20. We thought legislation was going to be the most difficult thing to change. Within 2 months, we changed the legislation, but we got lucky. There was an election. 60% of the population is below 30 years old. 25 of the largest companies went to the government and said, if you make some changes and some incentives, we'll increase the number of apprenticeships. And guess what? The legislation changed. Social Security benefits and also incentives for companies that do more than a certain amount of apprenticeships got a tax incentive. So things can move when you get the right parties around the table. In Malawi, when we launched the network, we had the Minister of Labor and we had the Minister of the opposition party. The GAN is a political, neutral group. But it's one of those places where this is a topic where the left, the right, the conservatives, the liberals, they come together because they know this is a serious issue. And so we've been able in Malawi to actually change the legislation, and now we have a minimum wage for apprentices. But this hasn't been an easy path. To get the word out there and to get our global companies to embrace this, for instance, a global company, we said, how many interns do you have? How many apprentices do you have? And that was a nightmare, because every country had a different definition. And so when we're trying to look at our commitments, we have 217 companies globally. We have 13 national networks. We were very pleased on the 13th of June to launch our 13th network with no other than the King of Belgium, the EU Commissioner, and our CEO of Adecco. Plus many companies joining, but they know they have a problem. The legislation is an issue. We've now been able to raise, over these 4.5 years, over 9 million commitments. Now, these are only our global companies and our regular members. And I have to say to you, those are not all apprenticeships. And the reason why is we've had a problem in the definitions. And while apprenticeship systems can often take 10 to 15 years to build if you don't have all the partners in the educational system in place, we are whetting the appetite of employers. We are getting them to commit. And maybe it is an internship, a traineeship, a learnership, but we hope to get to all apprenticeships. Now, there are some trends, and how do we get this up to scale, particularly apprenticeships? We're noticing that when we started off, it was about youth. Today, it's about the 50-year-old man in these countries who is losing his job and needs to be reskilled, which is not an easy task. It's about shortening. Many of our IT companies are saying they don't want 3-year apprenticeships. What about 6-month apprenticeships to start with? What about focusing on the soft skills? And this is the one thing the employers say. The benefit of an apprenticeship is actually not the technical skills. They feel many of them can teach those. It's the soft skills, particularly of the young people. Blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs, what about new-collar jobs? We don't need a university degree for every job. And so there are some very creative things IBM is doing in these positions where it's a high school diploma plus 2 years. It's linked to an associate's degree. You get a degree, you get an apprenticeship. E-apprenticeships. Every country, almost even companies, are reinventing the wheel. And that worries me because I think it's a waste of resources. There is a way that we could streamline this and use technology better. There are new industries, and we are going from skills to degrees and reskilling and upskilling. We have the 2020 challenge at the GAN. We want to reach to 20 million opportunities for youth. And lastly, we are campaigning to get the word out there through social media. Please take out your phones. Please tweet this. Please get the word out there, because everyone who's in this room is what I call an influencer, and you can get the word out there, which is very important to parents and young people. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Questions for Shay? Yes, sir.
My name is Jayant Krishna, and I work for the Skill India mission. See, in our country, we have made several reforms in the sense that we almost took a wish list from industry, large, medium, and small sector, and almost 95% of their wish list was granted by the government. The act was enacted, and the new act is very, very industry friendly. Not only that, we also floated a apprenticeship promotion scheme where the entire basic training component of apprenticeship used to be, it is still reimbursed to the companies who do apprenticeship, who provide this facility. And 25% of the stipend paid to the apprentices is also reimbursed to all, not to those who achieve beyond a threshold, but to all people who board the apprenticeship bus, Not only that, our stipend paid to the apprentices used to be very, very low. So we have linked it to the minimum wages. And in the first year of apprenticeship, it is 70% of the minimum wages, followed by 80% and 90% in the year 2 and year 3. So all that we did, practically whatever industry wanted, we as a country granted. But things are still not moving. So while there's some improvement, but not as much as we anticipated. We need some serious inputs as to what went wrong, one is this, and also a slightly different question that, some examples of advocacy done for more and more industries to offer apprenticeship and more candidates to youth, to use it as an opportunity to transform their lives and board the apprenticeship bus. So both, there are two different questions. I don't know who would like to take it in the panel, but we need some, we thought whatever was required for India as a country, we have done it, but still the results have not improved as much as we wanted.
That's a really good question. Shay, do you want to come back on how we can really get employers involved?
Actually, it's a really good point. Barring this, something that I read, and I can't honestly quote the person because I can't remember, we've sold the idea, we haven't bought it yet. We've gotten the word out there. There are incentives. What worries me is job growth is in SMEs. It's not in the multinationals. And we have a lot of multinationals. They're walking the talk. But there are few. There are not that many. But there are some very interesting initiatives that I would give you two. Microsoft and Nestle, who are members of ours. In the UK, for instance, Microsoft has a program for the IT sector, but they only need 150 apprentices. That's not a big number. And so in order to reach impact, one of the things that they're doing is they're offering their apprenticeship program to their supply chain, to their clients, in order to reach the impact. And they're hoping to reach 10,000. Another example, Astra International from Indonesia is a member of ours. They have a whole foundation that trains young people in apprenticeships that never work for them. They actually go out and they work for the SMEs. A lot of these large companies are training young people who they can't take in. And so they offer them to the SMEs. So for me, for impact, we have to hit the SMEs. It's not easy. But I will say also in Asia in particular, parents, and when I interviewed in India, every parent wants their child to either be a doctor or a lawyer. And it is so hard to change that mindset. And so when I did my study, actually, in South Africa, they said to me, can you find an apprentice in a suit and not in a blue-collar sort of worker, et cetera? And I really had to think. And I came back to Switzerland. And on our board is the CEO of UBS, who at every meeting tells his story that he started at 15. He didn't want to go to school. He wanted to play tennis or ski. His parents says you have to do something, so he went and did a banking apprenticeship. He went into it and he says, I'll never like banking. And he said, I actually really liked it. And it helped me with my career choice. He went back to school, and that's the beauty of the Swiss system. He was able to go back to school, and he's a CEO today. So I think sharing best practices, sharing good stories, convincing parents, but also career counselors. Especially in the US, they're stressing this because most career counselors measure their success on how many of the kids go to university. They're never thinking of apprenticeships. And so I think we've made a lot of progress in getting the word out there. It's not enough. We need to do more. So please, we will send you our toolkit about how to get the word out there.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on, but if we have time later on. I would just add that kind of the OECD, the focus of our work most recently has been on the cost-benefit analysis, making sure that for employers, kind of those, apprentices really pay for themselves, and there are public policy interventions which can ensure that apprenticeship pays. And we think that there's this important motivation there, a focus there for trying to get that right in terms of public policy. Our fourth speaker today, well, I'm afraid because it's going to be your time, so I mean, it's a really quick point.
A very quick point. Hi.
Okay, make a quick point.
Thank you for presenting this network. It seems to be very impressive. And just one short question. You are mentioning that you are consulting more than 100 companies worldwide. How many apprentices or young people have you consulted? Or is it planned to consult them in the future? Or any cooperations with young people representations or apprenticeship representations? Do you have something in mind on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's key. And we're trying to get our board to convince that we need to have a youth representative on our board. But we do storytelling. And when we do best practices, the companies tend to bring up to the stage their apprentices. That's the best way to tell the story. So letting young people tell what they've learned, how the work environment worked, etc. So storytelling. But they also need to be there at the table, and at the local networks, we are insisting that the young people are there. Now, as I said to you, our apprenticeship networks are run by federations and companies. We're looking for youth groups, women's groups, other groups that might want to even do a virtual network to get the word out there. So youth are critical.
Thank you. Our fourth speaker in this session is Hang Ho. She's head of JP Morgan's Global Philanthropy for Europe, for Middle East, for Africa, for Latin America. I understand that you're responsible for 22 countries. It's a big job. We're very pleased to welcome you here today.
Thanks, Anthony. I know time is short, so I'll try to be succinct. And maybe actually I'll start by responding to the gentleman's comment earlier in, so I wear two hats. One is how we approach this work from a foundation, and then how we approach this work as an employer. And as a foundation, I guess, for us, I mean, the both hats that I wear, it's less about policy and sort of, this kind of long-term framework. It's much more about practically what are we able to do to respond to the current gaps or requirements that we see sort of, from what is currently happening. And so based on sort of, the work certainly from the foundation across sort of, these 23 countries as part of the sort of, 40 countries that we operate in, the gaps that we see from sort of, the current apprenticeship systems in the context of the changing world, economically, technologically, demographically, and the rest of it, is that the system is working, but it's not working for everybody. So what are we able to do in very practical terms to support sort of, that point of accessibility for people from a much broader range of socioeconomic backgrounds, and also from ethnic as well as gender. I mean, a lot of people have already shared a lot of best practice. I think sort of, for us, a couple of sort of effective mechanism that we have seen through our work is effective pre-apprenticeship, traineeship, whatever you want to call it, to at least equal the footing for sort of people to be able to compete with their peers onto good quality apprenticeship. So I think effective pre-apprenticeship, and there are many different ways that they come in, and they are tailored to sort of various different needs from different groups. The other effective mechanism that we have also seen is how can they be more flexible, and I think certainly sort of flexibility when you consider sort of the female participation objective of many different countries, and when you combine that with sort of say caring responsibility or sort of just many other requirements. I think how do we help preserve sort of the fundamental principle that underpin a good apprenticeship, but delivered in a way that cater for life, because not everybody can afford to sort of take 2 to 3 years, 9 to 5, and whatever to do that. And so sort of there are many different good practice that I can sort of share offline in terms of organization deliver on the ground. I think for us, going back to the point that somebody made earlier, the capacity of this institution to go at scale is something of a real challenge as we observe. So we're also working with international and regional institutions to, number one, figure out how we can package up some of these practical examples and share, but not in a theoretical way, because we know that adaptation is one of the big issues. So actually, how do we package it up? How do we then bring people together and have a real conversation about sort of this is in theory how it would work, but this is how it might actually be adapted to a different country context. And more importantly, then invest in those capacity building exercise for people to implement as well. It's one thing to tell people this is what to do, but the question of take up and implementation is a real challenge. The second aspect that we've also identified from sort of our work in terms of need and gaps is sort of clearly everybody has alluded to the fact that industry is changing, professions are changing, jobs are changing, and of course apprenticeship has been there for a long time, and they're definitely much more developed and much more mature in certain industries and certain sectors. Question is, in the new jobs and the new careers and the new kind of pathways, would apprenticeship still be the right mechanism to support people sort of, to access them rather than relying on sort of traditional higher education? I don't think we are totally agnostic. We're happy to kind of pilot or support pilot and figure out. It might be right for some people. It might not be right for some people. It might be right for some roles. It might not be right for some other roles. And I think for us, the most important thing is to be able to support people to identify the right pathways and where apprenticeship serves as the right model. And does it need to be delivered in the same way that we have known it for the past sort of, like 200 years? It might apply in some cases. It might not be. And so again, sort of, we've got some really good kind of pilot results both in the US but also in places like Ireland, where people are really sort of innovating in how apprenticeship can be applied in sort of the changing context of health. So not traditional healthcare anymore, but these new kind of community health worker or medical coding, and in Ireland, sort of, with the government's embrace of sort of, technology, what are some of the different mechanisms that apprenticeship can be adapted? Probably the last point that I would say is from an employer's perspective, and also building on what Shay mentioned. I think, look, for us as an employer, we cannot say one route is better than others. We need to be open to all, because that's the best way to get to the best talent. What I would say is that certainly sort of apprenticeship is an important consideration for us. It's something that we have been doing for quite some time in the UK and in some other sort of Asian countries. So, certainly sort of with the levy in the UK has spurred us to think about sort of what we can do more And actually, Lorna mentioned that earlier, as there's now a plethora of employers looking at how to use the levy to push more of the apprenticeship at high university degree level, and we already see the behavior of universities introducing alternative provisions, and of course anybody would prefer an apprenticeship from Cambridge versus an apprenticeship from BPP. What is BPP? Who is BPP? So we're definitely mindful of that. But I think to this point, and certainly from the experience that we're seeing in the UK, from a big employer's perspective, there's a lot of higher level apprenticeship, and then there are also a lot of level 1 and 2 apprenticeship as well. There's nothing in the middle. And so it's both a question of it's not addressing the skills need, but also going back on the inclusion side. People, we're probably going to meet our target of hitting however many apprenticeship starts, but if they're all level 1 and level 2, people are just not going to get there in terms of progression. Shay mentioned the point about SMEs, though. We can afford to do all of these things, right? And we're expanding, we're doing more in terms of apprenticeship as progression, apprenticeship to convert people from non-finance to finance, from non-technology to technology. But SMEs don't have the resources to do so. For us, I think a couple of things that we're seeing interesting in terms of good practice. So we're actually working with Bertelsmann Stiftung to figure out in terms of 1 minute. Sure. In terms of this question of cost. So somebody mentioned about incentives. I think incentives are good, but only if you know how to make the most of that incentives. And most SMEs don't have the bandwidth or time to figure out the administrative hurdle to get to these incentives. So there's cost, there's benefit, and also direct support, like technical direct support. So those are all of the things that I think would be good to look into if you really want to kind of improve the effectiveness of this.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We have time for one question, and we have a lady here who would like to ask it.
It's related to pedagogy in terms of the variety of group that you have within your network. And according to our colleague from London and the delegate from UNESCO, that they are dealing with lifelong learning, literacy, even skills. How do you tackle pedagogy in terms of this variety of group that you have, especially within our first page declaration? We are going to discuss here about the advancement of technology and pedagogy over time. This is my question. If you can elaborate how you tackle advancement of pedagogy, because you know there are different approaches, and we are mostly within our educational systems acquainted with behaviorist approach. I am interested to know what is your selection within the network.
I'll take it first, and I'll do the cop-out answer since we're an employer. So the cop-out answer, most of all, is that we rely on our educational partners who are the experts in this. What we do try to do is, I mean, from an inclusion side, we know that you need to reach a certain level from your educational attainment in order to access apprenticeship. And we see that there's a plethora of people from certain backgrounds that are not getting to, in London, it will be the A to C equivalent GCSE, right? So if you don't get that, most of the progression pathways are shut for you. So we are working actually with a couple of institutions who are really looking at how do you teach and how do you develop curriculum in a way that enable young people to achieve equivalence so that they can actually operate in an apprenticeship environment. So happy to share those examples offline. And then the other really interesting example that we are also collaborating on is with the Behavioural Insight Unit in the UK to deploy sort of, both behavioural insight technique and technology to embed that into curriculum design, but also kind of behavioural nudges to see whether that also help increase the attainment of young people to supplement what we are able to provide as an employer.
Thank you. And I think it'd be amiss of me if I didn't ask Helen if you wanted to just add a word on the end of that.
I think it's important that we mention the tutors and the people who are doing an important role in the workplace, and also the teachers in the schools who are engaged as well in the apprenticeship. What we have done, for example, first of all, we organized a training for the master craftsmen. We organized the training for the teachers and how they connect. But we have also organized peer learning because there is a need for communication between those two worlds, and sometimes that doesn't happen. So I think one part of the pedagogy is also to get the right people trained and capacitated to do so. And we make, that's part of the quality of the apprenticeship. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen, and doesn't happen systematically. Of course, in the most advanced system, there is a much more structured way to appoint the tutors or the master craftsmen. But in the case of many countries, people are appointed, and they are giving an apprentice who comes with a problem, because the apprentice doesn't come only for learning. It comes with adolescent, it comes with other problems. And when we organized the training, part of the discussion was not about the teaching and learning process, but was these people are having, they're changing, they're getting matured. And you need more than just the pedagogy, you need psychology, you need other things. And I think the training of the tutors is something that is very important. And the point you are mentioning in the gap in the workplace is that we do training for, call them HR people, and training for the tutors who are working directly with apprentices. But with the change of the labor market, whom you will train, who will be the contact point with the apprentices? That's something that we have to look at, and some of what you are mentioning would be interesting to look at.
Thank you, thank you. We move to our final presentation of this session, and we welcome to the floor Helmut Zeloth, Senior Specialist in Vet Policies and Systems at the European Training Foundation, who in recent years has worked across a huge number of countries, and we're very pleased that he's here to share his thoughts.
Thank you so much. I don't ask you now if you would prefer to go to a coffee break or to listen to the 2 remaining minutes that I still have. Then, yeah. But I think before I start sharing some experience of global or regional initiatives from my organization, which is an agency of the European Union. We are governed by the European member states and the European Commission. My colleague Helen was before here on the panel, so I don't speak about the European Alliance for Apprenticeships, but indirectly, yes, you will see. But first I would like to share with you maybe 2 experiences. The first one, do you know the feeling that you went to a conference, maybe an apprenticeship conference, and then you go out and you think we were all talking about the same things and about the same terms. And then later on, you get back to a colleague of who was also there at the conference, and then you discover, or you discover not, that there are some differences. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't matter. And I want to come to a point that I think I came across many times when I worked with countries, and this is the issue of illusion. It's not only the issue of illusion of us international organizations that we believe we know it all or we do it always right. No, we don't do, I think. Yeah? We make many mistakes, we also learn from the mistakes, and sometimes we learn more than we give, sometimes. Yeah. But I want to say about also the illusions on the other side. Because we came across, or I came across with big illusions, and I tell you 2 or 3. The first one is that people, policymakers, but also sometimes implementers, believe that apprenticeship is a quick fix. Whatever they want to fix, if it's the employment, or if it's the training, or whatsoever, and it is not. In the morning, there was the talk about the rediscovery of the apprenticeship. I mean, we talk now almost about 10, 12 years about that. 10 years ago, the international memorandum from INAP, Erica Smith was here as vice chair of the International Network of Apprenticeships, was issued. So it's quite some time. Many publications came out. There is a wealth of networks, a wealth of initiatives. All international organizations are active in that field. But still, we are sometimes at the beginning, isn't it? So we feel there is still a long way to go. Second illusion, policymakers or people think apprenticeship will change the whole VAT system. It may become the most important part of that. If I look to realities, then I see that in most of the countries, it is a very tiny segment. And I see also that some countries, let's say Egypt, Lebanon, 20, 30 years, they have started to implement pilots, and they are in the thousands, but in the 3,000s or 30,000s, and not in the 3 million that the UK government now is aiming to reach in 2 years or so, and reached maybe in 10 years time, then, under different conditions. Yeah. So second illusion, it's a long-term process. It's a long-term process, not a short-term process. We need long breath. There are many hiccups. There are many ups and downs. Yeah. I think that's a lesson that I learned, that we learned, also that donors learn when they have 3 years project, 5 years project, and still the things are not working. Maybe the pilot is not yet sustainable. There needs to be another project, and so on. I think that's very important to know, to have this longer term perspective. And sometimes we think, I think, too short term. And what we do as an organization, if I can say, apart from supporting some countries, we are an agency that supports the VAT reforms, and of course apprenticeship needs to be part of the VAT reform, or even higher education. We learned about that. Is we have country initiatives and then regional initiatives. For example, coming back to the, in my opinion, successful initiative of the European Alliance for Apprenticeships, we helped the candidate countries from the European Union, former ex-Yugoslavia countries, to adhere, to be part of that, and to get fully integrated. Every year we do a joint seminar where we exchange with the candidate countries, because we as European agency, we are working outside the European Union countries, not with the European Union countries, but with about 30 countries neighboring to the European Union. Some of them are candidate countries, yeah? And we help them to get integrated successfully, I think. Every year we have a joint seminar, and for example, 2 years ago, Montenegro decided to introduce dual education. Serbia decided already 1 year before. And here is another risk of illusion when we talk about apprenticeship. We think we talk all about the same. We have seen situations where countries call apprenticeships something, and it is not. And they call something traineeship, but it is apprenticeship, maybe. Yeah? And I see a trend very recently now. I would not fully agree on that, what was said before. I see in the last years, in a morning session, that apprenticeship, of course, is getting now more and more recognized as a term. Of course, there are standards, there are criteria. ILO has standards, European Commission has criteria. There is more and more agreement on certain things. But if we look globally, there is also a trend that more and more countries speak about dual education. Education. Did you notice this term? Not training. Dual education. Yeah? I believe that there is a kind of a hybrid model that is emerging, perhaps at the expense of apprenticeship, maybe also because apprenticeship is very difficult to implement. We from the ETF, we say you can see work-based learning. We say work-based learning and apprenticeship is part of it. We agree with the ILO. It's the golden standard of work-based learning, but it is also the most difficult thing to reach. There is a vertical dimension, there's a horizontal dimension. The vertical dimension means the difficulty of the type of the work-based learning. The horizontal one means the extent of work-based learning, 50%, 80% taking place in the companies. Yeah? So I think there is also something that we need to look at this kind of issue, dual education. We need we made a regional initiative in Soviet Union countries, former Soviet Union countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, and so on. And also this initiative helped to get started at a small pilot scale. However, we noticed these countries are still focusing on traineeships. For them, it's too difficult to get into a real apprenticeship. Yeah? And when they do some pilots, it's maybe not the full criteria that we speak of. For example, it's not to earn and to learn. It's just to learn and to work, but maybe not to earn. Yeah? So there is no contract. There is maybe no salary. It's voluntary by companies that they can be paid. It's not as regulated. Yeah? I stop now because I think it was over the time. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Helmut. And I gave you a couple more minutes because while you were speaking, I was passed a note to say, let's go straight to coffee. I think there's a feeling in the room that people would like coffee. So that's just left to me to say thank you very much to our panel. They're all going to be here in the coffee break, particularly Helmut, if you have select questions for him. So let's just say thank you very much to the esteemed panel. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mr. Mann, and thank you very much for a very interesting panel, another very interesting one. So you will have the time now to interact, ask questions, come with comments, but during the coffee break. So go ahead now, have your coffee. Please come back here. Should we say 10 past 4? 10 past 4? Okay, good. Then we're not behind the schedule.